In every neighborhood, there are homes that appear perfectly ordinary. Curtains drawn at night, lights flickering in the living room, the sound of a television drifting out into the street. But sometimes, what happens behind those closed doors is far from ordinary. Sometimes, the truth is so horrific, it shakes a community to its core. In the summer of 2017, neighbors on Hawthorne Lane in a quiet suburban town began to notice something unusual. Margaret Harris, a 68-year-old retired schoolteacher known for her warm smile and kind words, had vanished. Her son, Daniel Harris, assured everyone she was away, on a much-needed vacation. But weeks passed. No postcards, no phone calls, no visits. Just silence. Then, the smell started. A stench so overpowering, it forced neighbors to close their windows in the middle of summer. A smell that could not be ignored, and one that would reveal a chilling truth. This is the story of Daniel Harris, the man who claimed his mother went on a vacation while hiding a horrifying secret inside their home. Margaret Harris was a woman who dedicated her life to teaching. For more than 3 decades, she worked as an elementary school teacher, shaping young minds, encouraging curiosity, and earning the love and respect of everyone who knew her. After retiring, she enjoyed gardening, church events, and afternoon teas with neighbors. She was the kind of neighbor who always remembered birthdays, who'd bring cookies over during the holidays, who checked in on the sick and elderly. Everyone adored her. Everyone, it seemed, except the one person she trusted most, her only son, Daniel. Daniel Harris was 37 years old. To outsiders, he was quiet, perhaps even shy. He rarely socialized, rarely worked, and mostly kept to himself. After his father died of cancer 5 years earlier, Daniel moved back into his childhood home to live with his mother. Neighbors assumed he was helping care for her, but in reality, it was Margaret who was caring for him. Daniel struggled to hold down steady work. He drifted from one odd job to another, warehouse work, part-time retail, a few months in construction, but nothing lasted. Financially, he depended on Margaret's pension, her savings, and the home she had worked her entire life to pay off. We all thought he was this devoted son, living with her to keep her company. But now, looking back, I think it was the other way around. She was supporting him. He didn't really have much going on. Behind closed doors, the relationship between mother and son was far from peaceful. Arguments about money, responsibility, and Daniel's lack of direction became frequent. Margaret wanted her son to grow up, to build a life of his own. But Daniel wanted something else. Control. In the summer of 2017, Margaret Harris suddenly disappeared from her familiar routines. Neighbors who were used to seeing her tending to her flowers, chatting over the fence, or walking to church, noticed her absence almost immediately. It was strange. Margaret loved her garden. She was always out there, every morning, pruning and watering. After a week of not seeing her, I asked Daniel where she was. He just smiled and said, "Oh, she's gone on vacation." Daniel told neighbors his mother had taken a trip to Florida to visit old friends. According to him, she needed a break, time away to enjoy herself. On the surface, it seemed plausible. Margaret was retired, independent, and certainly capable of traveling. But those who knew Margaret found it unusual. She wasn't the type to leave without telling anyone, and she certainly wasn't the type to disappear for weeks without so much as a phone call. She would always tell me when she was leaving town, even if it was just for a weekend. She'd say, "Keep an eye on the house for me." This time, nothing. It didn't sit right. Friends and family began to notice the silence too. Phone calls went unanswered. Text messages delivered but never replied to. At first, they trusted Daniel's explanation. After all, why would he lie about his own mother? But as days stretched into weeks, doubts grew stronger. I left her 3 voicemails. Margaret always called back. Always. But this time, nothing. After 2 weeks, I started to think something was wrong. While Margaret remained absent, Daniel's behavior became increasingly strange. He avoided long conversations, kept the blinds closed, and seemed nervous when anyone brought up his mother. I asked him when she was coming back, and he just shrugged. He didn't even give me a date, just said, "Whenever she's ready." It was odd. Really odd. Weeks passed. Margaret never showed up to Sunday service, never returned to her garden, never called her friends. The community was unsettled, but Daniel's words, his mother was simply on vacation, became the story people reluctantly accepted. For now, by mid-August, a new detail emerged. Something the entire neighborhood noticed. Something impossible to ignore. A foul odor began seeping from the Harris residence. It was this awful, sickly smell. At first, I thought maybe something had died under the porch, like a raccoon or a squirrel. But it kept getting stronger and stronger. You couldn't sit outside without gagging. The smell clung to the air, forcing neighbors to keep their windows shut in the middle of a sweltering summer. It was undeniable, overpowering, and horrifyingly familiar to some. I knew that smell. I'd smelled it before when a deer was hit by a car down the road. That's not garbage. That's something dead. When confronted, Daniel brushed it off. He blamed the smell on trash, on plumbing issues, even suggesting an animal might have died in the crawl space. But his explanations never matched the intensity of the stench that now filled the street. Behind closed doors, Daniel fought a losing battle, trying desperately to mask what was rotting inside his home. Finally, after weeks of speculation, someone made the call. A neighbor, unable to stand the smell and the secrecy any longer, phoned the police. They requested a welfare check on Margaret Harris. On August 24th, police arrived at the Harris home. Daniel answered the door, reluctant to let them inside. He insisted his mother was fine, that she was still on vacation. But the smell inside the house told a different story. When police entered the Harris residence, the stench that neighbors had complained about hit them immediately. It wasn't the smell of garbage, or spoiled food, or an animal hidden in the walls. The officers recognized it instantly, the unmistakable odor of human decomposition. The house was in disarray. Dishes piled high in the sink, food rotting on counters, a television blaring to no one in particular. But the deeper they went inside, the stronger the smell became, pulling them toward the back of the house. At the end of a narrow hallway, police found a locked bedroom door. Daniel insisted there was nothing inside, that it was just storage. But when officers demanded access, his face went pale. The officers pushed inside. The smell was overwhelming now, suffocating. And there, lying motionless on the bed, was the body of Margaret Harris. She had been dead for weeks, wrapped loosely in blankets, left to decompose in her own home, just a few steps away from where her son lived every day. It was a discovery that horrified even seasoned investigators. Margaret Harris hadn't gone on vacation. She hadn't gone anywhere. She had been in that house all along, while her son told the world she was away enjoying herself. Daniel Harris was taken into custody immediately. At first, he stuck to his story. His mother had gone on vacation, he insisted. He didn't know how she ended up dead in her room. But under pressure, his lies began to unravel. Daniel, the neighbors smelled it. The officers smelled it. You've been living here for weeks. Don't tell me you didn't know. Investigators soon pieced together the truth. Margaret had suffered a violent death. The autopsy revealed blunt force trauma to the back of her head. She had been struck, hard and deliberately, most likely with a household object. Why would a son kill his mother? The answer, investigators discovered, was money. Margaret's pension and savings were Daniel's only lifeline. He hadn't held steady employment in years. Records showed that in the weeks after Margaret's disappearance, Daniel had been using her accounts, paying his bills, withdrawing cash, even shopping online. The truth was clear. Without his mother, Daniel had nothing. And so, prosecutors argued, he decided to remove the one person who stood in the way of controlling her finances, his own mother. We heard shouting that night. He was always asking her for money. Looking back, he seemed desperate. Neighbors later recalled loud arguments between mother and son in the weeks leading up to her death. Some remembered hearing a loud thud one night, followed by silence. At the time, they brushed it off. Later, those memories took on a haunting new meaning. Perhaps the most damning evidence came from Daniel's computer. Investigators found internet searches revealing a chilling awareness of what he had done. He had looked up how to mask the smell of decomposition, how long a body could go undiscovered, even how to access pension benefits after a death. The evidence was overwhelming. Daniel Harris's vacation story had collapsed, replaced by a far darker truth. In 2019, nearly 2 years after Margaret Harris's body was found, her son Daniel went on trial for her murder. The case drew widespread attention, not only because of the brutality of the crime, but because it struck at the heart of something deeply unsettling, a child killing the very person who had given them life. Prosecutors painted Daniel as manipulative and greedy. They argued that he had grown resentful of his mother's control over their finances. Margaret had been considering changing her will, limiting his access to her pension, and pushing him to find work. For Daniel, that was the breaking point. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this was not an accident. This was not a crime of passion. This was a calculated act. Daniel Harris killed his mother for money, and then lived in that house day after day as her body rotted behind a locked door. The evidence was stacked high. The autopsy confirming blunt force trauma, the bank records showing his withdrawals, the chilling internet searches, and of course, the weeks-long lie about a so-called vacation. The defense, however, argued that Daniel was not a cold-blooded killer, but a man crumbling under the weight of mental illness. They described him as socially isolated, depressed, and emotionally unstable. They suggested that the killing was not premeditated, but the tragic result of a heated argument that spiraled out of control. Daniel Harris loved his mother, but he was overwhelmed, isolated, and dependent. This was not murder for profit. It was a desperate act by a man who had lost control. The defense's attempt to sway the jury faced an uphill battle. Jurors were shown photographs of the crime scene, bank receipts, and screenshots of Daniel's online searches. The image of Margaret's decomposed body, abandoned in her own home while her son carried on life as if nothing had happened, was seared into their minds. After just 4 hours of deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous decision. Daniel Harris was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At the moment of sentencing, Daniel showed little reaction. He simply stared forward, expressionless, as the reality of his future was sealed. For the community, the verdict was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the loss of Margaret Harris left a permanent void. She was remembered not as the victim of a brutal crime, but as a teacher, a neighbor, and a friend who had given her life to helping others. Margaret Harris trusted her son. She opened her home to him, supported him financially, and cared for him long after he should have been independent. In return, he ended her life. The tragedy of this case is not just the crime itself, but the betrayal at its heart. It's a reminder that sometimes, the danger we fear doesn't come from strangers in the night. It comes from within our own homes, from the people closest to us. Today, Daniel Harris remains behind bars, serving a life sentence. But the story of Margaret Harris lives on, not as a headline, but as a warning, and as a tribute to a woman who deserves so much better. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, disturbing, or thought-provoking, please consider supporting the channel. Like this video, share it with others, and subscribe for daily true crime documentaries that explore the darkest corners of human behavior. Your support helps us bring more cases like this to light. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, sometimes evil hides where you least expect it.